Hi all. How are we going? Looking forward to penultimate video Facebook live session today. Just getting ourselves started up now. And I've assembled a bit of stuff here that I'm hopefully we're going to have a very informative session today for those that are considering basing and the like. I'm on location back at the other place, and you can see my case behind me, and I've tapped into that with some materials for today. So today we're going to be covering off handling with care. That's what I call it, or basing and bases. Looking at the things that help display your figures. We've talked a lot about getting to this point. We're in the final stages. We've got our figure. We've been painting them, working on them, or her. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we finish them off, or how we finish her off, how we put her on a suitable base, how we use that base to display or carry on and tell a little bit more about a story, just adding to what that figure or figures are about. Trust it's going to be useful for you. Really looking forward to it. As I said, I've got a pile of stuff here that I want to go through and talk about, and I'm hoping that each of these will provide some examples and just some consideration for you guys to think about what you're doing in terms of how you approach this. Very much an introduction, very much a starter or a primer on basing. Righto, on location here in front of the cabinet, and what I thought I'd do is just give a little bit of an introduction and then start on the meat and potatoes of today. Let's start, of course, with a little bit of looking. Got to have the glasses, see who's coming through. Looks like I've got a good bunch. Remember, this is number 2 guy. This is the second to last. This is number 9. We're going to be finishing tomorrow, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Let's see who's online, team. Okay, Tony, great to see you, mate. Fantastic, first in, awesome. Dave, always great to have you here. Really appreciate it, mate. You'll see some of the classics from back in the day, exactly when I was sort of following what you were doing. Alan, nice to have you on. Hi, Tone. Jordi, nice to have you here. Let's see, got a few people coming through. Scotty, okay, great to see you, mate. Fantastic. And also, I think it's Roma from Russia. Nice to have you on board. Thank you. Hi, guys. Nice to see you. Abel. I'm thinking hola. Nice to have you. And Zach coming through. Hello, mate. Yep, for sure. And David. Hola, David. Great to see you guys on board. Righto, I'm at my other house. I'm looking at what we're doing a little bit further away. This is where my main cabinet is. You get the chance to see this today, tomorrow. That'll be the last time it'll be like that. It's all getting packed up, getting ready for the move. So we're going to see what happens in terms of that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about capturing the moment with you tomorrow when we talk a little bit photography. But today we're talking about basing and bases, or handling with care. Okay, I've got you on the stand. I'm going to pull you off the stand, have a quick look at the display that we've got set up. We'll talk about all the materials that are in place here. Before that though, let's have a think about a few thank yous. Righto. Still coming through. Good to see you, Greg. And Matt, always welcome. And Bryce, lovely to see you, man. Hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time, eh? Okay, on the bench today, I've got a pile of stuff. I'm gonna do a proper sweep through in this in a second, just to sort of show you. Before I start though, I want to start with a couple of definitions, right? First definition is, what are we talking about on today's session? So we're talking about the display and the handling with care of figures, right? So when I think about figures, I'm thinking about a display for a single or a pair. They sort of go together. Or alternatively, what I call a vignette. In Mike's terms, a vignette is 3 to 5 figures. A vignette, V-I-G-N-E-T-T-E, is a display of 3 to 5 figures. I've got a little stash just come in from my mate Darren yesterday. 5 little Tommies, 5 little Tommy Brit soldiers, which I'm going to display on a vignette Those 5 surrounded, that's what the aim is, and that's the intention of showing that. Under pressure, a few little Anzacs and a tight spot. That's a vignette. The other thing I'm going to be using in the display today, we're going to be talking, you can just see a little bit of it here. We're going to see my mate Andy Belsey's created for me a display for 3 little kiwis at Gallipoli, and we're going to be using that for the discussion around the design of your basing, the design of the scene. Okay. In addition to that, what I'm going to be looking at is, we talked about single, we talked about vignette. I'm not going to be talking about dioramas. Okay, so tucked away in the back of that case is a little diorama that was made inspired by Shet Pain. I'm not going to be talking about those. You can just see it over my back shoulder there. Just there. Down there, see that one there? Okay, we're not going to zoom in on it. It's an Opel Blitz, 5 little guys on it, a gun crew, 20mm flak veiling from German Desert Africa Corps. That's pride of place in there because that's my serious, my first odd diorama, done many years ago, totally inspired and designed off Shet Pain. One of the reasons that was so important is because that was the first time I painted oil figures in oil. They were little artillery conversions, and I painted those guys up in oil, and that was the start of really getting serious about figure painting. So that's there, it's an important one. Looking a little bit battle damaged, to be fair, not just in the scene but in reality, because it's had to endure a few moves around the place as I've moved over the years. And as I said before, we're on another big move, so I'm going to be packing up all my figures over the next couple of days. Righto, so run back past again, definition, we're looking at single pair display or a vignette. We're not looking at dioramas today. Trust that makes sense. Now, in terms of what I'm looking at today, I am going to be considering, we'll mention dioramas, we'll mention scenery and basing. However, we'll focus mainly on the components and the design of that and thinking about that process, from very simple things right through to adding a scene. And you can tell a whole story with a single figure on an effective display. And I've got a special one that I want to really share that with you a little bit later on. Trust this is useful. Just before I start going through what's on my bench, let's have a quick check in, see a few other people have joined along. Let's see what we've got there. Okay, Detlef, Zach. Yep, got the life colours, mate. Stoked about those, just got them. And I'll be putting those to use today with Uncle, looking at using the leather of those. Just arrived from Darren with the little Tommies last night. So stoked to get those. Thanks very much, Zach. Pop those guys out of the way. Nice prompt, mate. Totally unexpected. Everard, good to see you, man. And nice to have you here. Remember, I did forget to give a call out to Everard a while back. You were the guy that sort of talked to me about doing this Facebook Live stuff. Took me a while to get into it. Really appreciate it and grateful for that support. And hola, Jam Gomez. Hola, Miguel. Okay, let's just have a quick look on the bench team. I'm going to bring you down. Joey Springer. Hi, Joey. Nice to see you, mate. Well done. Just going to bring you down off the stand. Let's have a quick look at the bench here, folks. So I mentioned the display cabinet. We're not going to spend much time on that, but I just wanted to, we can maybe talk about that tomorrow if you want to. Let's flip round to the bench and see what's on display today. Oh, I needed that. So team, what we're going to do, you can see my notebook in the back there for the script for today. We're going to be looking a little bit at Uncle. All right, we'll mention him as part of it. I've got some materials here that I'll be talking through, different stages of basing, different stages of display, right through to that final finished product. And there on the bottom, we've got a whole series of different bases and different elements. What I plan to do is just sort of zoom in on each of these and talk them through. A little bit late in the start this morning, and one of the reasons for that was I was just sort of trying to work out where to begin in terms of the display. Okay, so using my notes there, what we're going to talk about 3 components, right? You can see in the middle there, function, design, and story. That's what we're going to be considering in basing today. Function, design, and story. So you see the way I've displayed that. So we're talking about basing to start with, about the function of basing. Okay, I've got 3 elements on that. I've got 3 elements on design and 3 elements of story. And I'm going to be using that as I sort of work my way through. So in terms of bases, let's just talk first about the most fundamental base. We've already seen him, and it's most important to see him again. Uncle in action, and you can see he's making some progress. Today I'll be doing those boots and getting him sorted. But from a basing perspective, I think the importance of actually having a good base to work on. So I typically use corks, and you can see a little pin. All of my figures are pinned in the base at least. Now, I'm not going to pretend, let me just flick around here. I'm not going to pretend that I'm the world's best baser or diorama maker. Okay, had to mention that because in all honesty, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've actually, almost all my figures have gone out looking like this, painted with a pin in the bottom and a box. Nothing more than that. That's why it's an important part of this little element, just to talk about it. And I think it's critical in terms of the painting process. Now you can get a fancy holder that'll help support that. Perhaps I should have got one of those, because typically every 1 or 2 figures, what I'll actually do is I'll knock them over and do some battle damage. But I just wanted to mention the pin well up into the foot, and then carefully put in a cork as a starter. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually weight down that cork with some blue tack or some putty, or I've even tried some drawing pins. Just give it a little bit of body, because it's very light, and being careful about knocking over. One of the design elements I'm going to be doing is popping it into a little holder so it makes it more difficult to fall over. Very functional, and I think that's all I wanted to talk about there, was that very first form of basing, the very first form of function is the paint holder itself. Holding for painting. So just by put Uncle away, that's all he's going to be talking about today. The next element we're going to be talking about is actually starting looking at the final display. And what I've got here is I've got a few sections that I just wanted to share with you, so we can see the different elements coming through. Bases come in all forms. I prefer wooden ones, I prefer burl ones, but we've got a nice little resin block. You can see all set, carved up, bought online. Not too sure who actually provided that. Little basing element, this is from my mate Andy Kens. Little Poe for a par, which I'll display. Arguably a second figure to go behind a colonial Brit during the Maori New Zealand Wars, or the British colonialisation or invasion. And then I've got different sorts here, and I just wanted to just show you those as I've come through. What I'll do is I'll put you on the top, and I'll show you each of these elements and talk you through. Okay, hold there for a second, we're just going back up again. Onto the stand. Some of you have seen that stand, coming back. Okay, let's come back down to the bench top, and let's see how this works. First up, in terms of painting, I've already talked about the cork. I've talked about the importance of pinning the pin for the cork during painting, and naturally it's critical when I'm actually putting them on the base. So deep holes drilled through, that's the key securing point for any figure onto a base. In terms of the bases, they come in various forms, and consideration in terms of that final display is an important part of it. I've shown you a few little wood ones. What I want to do, purpose built, that's a base, bought off the shelf, ready to go, painted the sides black, top, pinhole, figure straight on. Pretty straightforward. Similarly, the little bases that come from Tommy's, my mate Andy Belsey makes these. Fantastic setup. They come in a pair. You can see this is the bottom, and this is an assembled one. Okay, so it comes in a bottom and a top, and you've got they're multi-pose, so you can mix and match the 5 of them with the different tops. Really neat concept, and they all fit together. Really like that. This is painted black because it's in the category, I'd say, as part of the final display. It's part of a prop for photography. So some of you guys might have seen my Uncle Percy Munn, which I painted for Andy last year. Sitting on it, that was the display that I used behind him just to help with the photograph. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. We'll probably come back to this base and talk about the props for that. Speaking of props, this is another one we'll come back to tomorrow, and that is the most used photographic prop that I've got. Sponge and a nice little base just to help out with photography. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Hystrix Agents model 1985 base. Used to be able to get these direct from Hystrix Agents. Beautifully done. Still there. A little bit of green base on the top. That's the ultimate, the most simple finish base that you could buy. I've got a little bit of dust and stuff, and again used as a prop. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Okay, very simple. Wood, varnished or stained. Green base on the bottom, green base on the top. Whack a Napoleonic figure on there, and you made. Little hole in the middle there. It's been used for many a photo, that little guy. Now I've got some other elements in terms of that basing we'll talk about later on. Little duck boards. You can buy lots of different accessories for basing. Many of you are familiar with you. I've got a whole bench you might have seen with different odds and ends. So I've got duck boards, little ladders. We'll have a look at one of those later on. These little guys just come on the market a couple of years ago. Fantastic little punch tools for making leaves. Some of you might have seen those, got some of those ones. Now all I'm doing is talking about just some of the scenic elements that you might put on the base. I don't tend to use a lot of the artificial stuff, to be honest. These guys I like because you can actually punch real leaves with them. Very simple. Whack a real leaf in, push down, and you get yourself 4 little tiny leaves. Lovely little pieces. A couple of companies make those. These ones came out of Aussie with a little Kickstarter promo. I prefer to do a bit of scrounging around the beach and follow little odds and sods. Beach and garden, you get so much material yourself in terms of that, and I'll use that, paint that up as part of simple basing materials. Having said that, what I do like to get, tea bags, if you're a tea drinker, fantastic little dried leaves come in those. If you can get these ones in mesh, they seem to be a bit of high quality. You've got some good options there. There's also herbs and spices like oregano that you can use. And in addition to that, when I'm doing that basing in the scenery, I'll be using things like these little pastel dust and the like from, I think it's Secret Army, something like that. Series of those, and of course, there's always a series of paints you can get, like AK Mud. Now I actually tend to use these on figures and stuff to integrate them with the groundwork. I think that's an important part of it. So whatever the groundwork is you're doing, it's critical as you're thinking it through that you're integrating in with it. What I'm talking about is that final display. I'm talking about just getting ready with that. So we've got the figure, we've got the base material, then we bring them all together. So that's talking about the function, that's talking about painting, preparing, how you're going to display it, and then the actual display. All right. Now what I'm going to be talking about is the design when you're thinking about it. 3 elements to design for base: size, shape, and structure. Size, shape, and structure. Now I'm talking about the physical base itself. Okay. There's a couple terms of it. And I'm also talking about the actual structure of the base. Okay, we'll look at that, we'll study that a little bit in a minute, which is Andy Belsey's work that we're working on, a little bit of a vignette of Gallipoli that I started. I actually painted those figures quite a few years ago. I've got one more figure to go. He's very simple to uncle. He's a little pointing native Maori pioneer officer. and we'll be popping him on that scene, but we'll have a look at it, study that a little bit more shortly, just to give you a little bit more detail. Right, remember today we're talking about bases and basing. I'm talking about handling with care. I've just described some of the components that you think about when you're thinking of the function of the base, holding stuff, thinking about how it's going to be used in terms of props or final display, and of course that actual display element and the components that you can put together on that one. Trust that makes some sense, and that's a useful element. So think about the function of the item that you're using to keep the figure safe and secure whilst you're painting and then in that final display element. Righto, let's move on to design. We've already mentioned those three parts: size, shape and structure. I've already shown you lots of different options with size or shape. In this case, round ones. Now I don't do a lot of round, I don't use a lot of round bases. However, they're very good to help tell a bit of a story. They're also nice in terms of getting a full round display. So if you've got a figure that deserves to be turned around, certainly that's where I would use one of those in terms of thinking about what I'm doing from a display. And very nice for a little vignette where you might have 3 or 4 figures that you want to put on that display. The catch with these fellas, for round ones, for me, is sometimes just in terms of the height, so size when I'm thinking about the figures are going, and secondly it's just the naming of them, and I like to have nameplates on most of my bases or little display elements, and sometimes a little bit harder to name them. Look, first world problems, to be honest, right? First world problems, really straightforward. You've got your base, these are beautiful displayed, fantastic polished wood. That little guy came through. I think that actually might even be an original Post Militaire, I'm not too sure, but beautiful for a single figure display that can be turned easily and used. This one comes complete with little cork legs on it, and I would suggest if you're doing a base, that sort of thing where you put a little cork sticky bases or little foam, it's pretty neat. I think the cork ones are probably better than the foam ones, because the foam ones can be a little bit, can change in shape and size. Right? Size, shape, talked about the block, okay, talked about the square one, same sort of thing. Now let's just talk a little bit more about when we're putting those together in terms of size and shape. I want to share with you, in terms of bases, always keeping an eye out for different bases. This little guy I showed you before is actually a little jewellery box thingy. Pop them open and tucked away inside there. Fantastic, right? I've been looking for that. That's an Indian arrowhead, and I didn't know where it had gone to, but I've just found it, right? That was from some friends in Kentucky who gifted that to me a few years ago from work. Awesome piece, Flint Indian arrowhead. Okay, I just wanted to show, man, I'm stoked that I found that. That was tucked away in that little box, and I use that as part of the display. So when I'm displaying my figures in display, I have a little bit of display element around. That little Indian arrowhead's a particularly special treasure that I tucked away carefully to make sure I didn't lose it. And although I had misplaced it, I hadn't lost it. But just wanted to say, you know, that's a nice little unit. I thought I spotted that in a handcraft shop, just a little display base. And it was originally intended to be like that, a little jewellery box, a little keepsake box for that Indian arrowhead. Flick it around that way, and you've got a perfect area to put a little bit of groundwork in there, and you've got a nice little base that comes through. This one was the funnest one I sort of tracked down. I wonder if you can identify what that's from. Okay, got a little bit of weight in it. And I found those guys perfect for display of some little Rackham figures that I got a few years ago. Now, I'm not gonna, you can get a photo of that. You can just see his little shadow coming in. It's a little orc sniper with a steampunky gun thing. We're not going to go into too much detail. I just want to give you a sort of shape, but you can see him on there. Now, that is actually, that little base there, very solid. That's actually what's called a finial. It goes on the end of a curtain rod. So the curtains that go across the top of the windows, curtains hang off, these fit on the end of them to stop the curtain rings sliding and the curtain falling off the end. Fantastic little things, beautiful shape, called a finial. They came in 2 sizes, okay, this little smaller size one, top, and you can see they're a cast metal, really good strength, great little solid, holds that up as part of the process. What I do is build a little putty element, and I'll pop that in there. This guy can actually pop out, but I've glued that one through into there. But you can actually construct that in that, and it's a fabulous little solid holder. Remember, we're talking about handling with care. Fantastic to handle this little guy with care. Oops, just about. Weighs quite, gives you a bit of heft to it, which is really neat. You might have noticed just on the back there, let's just see there. What I do is I autograph, most of my figures I autograph with a little MJB or a little signature. Quite often seen on artists, little MJB or Mike the Kiwi, just popped on the back of it. But I thought that's quite a nice little one to share with you. This, keeping your eye out for the little jewellery box, hiding that arrowhead, and this little curtain rod finial. Couple of options. And of course you've always got those purchasable ones. Okay. Now, we've talking about size, we've talked about shape. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about structure. And I just sort of been thinking through how to best do this one. I might clear a little bit of stuff away just to get ready for it, because I'm wondering how to best represent this little setup here, because I know my friend Andy Belsey, who's put this together, you know, I've done the figures, he's done the work behind it. I'd like to share a little bit more about that to give you a sense of how you use the base and that design of that scenic element to really pull the whole thing off. Remember, I mentioned today at the outset, on this call, on this live session, what we're actually doing is we're thinking about the display of single or a pair or 3 to 5 figures. So that's a single or a pair, that's one group, or a little vignette. So a vignette is a group of 3 to 5 figures that tell a story. We're not talking specifically about diorama. So I originally intended to have a whole heap of diorama basing material, but that's just not something I'm really into just at the moment. I love the scenery work, and I do tend to focus on what we've got there. However, over the last few years, I just haven't been involved in that. If you want to know more about dioramas, look, reach out to Spencer Pollard, have a look at his work, have a look at the videos he's doing at the moment. He's doing a wonderful retrospective on Francois Verlinden, who, you know, Francois Verlinden and Shep Payne provided some of the most amazing resources, inspiration back in the 70s, 80s, through into the early 90s for us, even up into the early 2000s. Those were the, for me, godfathers of figure presenting, historical military miniatures. They really brought so many into the hobby and inspired and coached and taught so many modelers about that process. So look out for Spencer. And there's one other guy I want to call out, because when we talk about, I've talked about this display, I've talked about vignettes, I'm focused mainly on figures. The reason I mentioned dioramas is because dioramas tend to be, the figures are part of the process and not the central theme of it. So in terms of a diorama, it's very much more about the scenic elements, or it's very much more about the vehicles or equipment that's displayed in there. And then, you know, in some cases you can actually, you know, very good displays from Andrew Argent where, you know, essentially it's just scenic elements. But one guy I want to really call out is Jean Diorama, who focuses on water scenes. And special mention, because some of you might have seen he's doing that, you know, 10-day challenge thing. Yesterday, beautiful little scene of a beached whale, little guy with a little dozer that he was standing on the back of, and he's throwing a bucket of water to cover the beach whale. You know, that's a diorama. That's where it's about the whole story and not the specific elements within that story. They all come together. So that's why we're focusing today on figures, and that's what this whole series is about. It's really been about the figures, the personality, and just how we enhance their story a little bit more. Slight digression. I just wanted to talk about that design. So we're going to come down. I think we're going to have a look at this display from Andy while I get these. Well, I move this around because it's a little bit fragile at the moment. It's not quite set up. So we'll come down, talk a little bit more about that. We'll talk about the work that Andy's done in this space too. So let's get this stuff out of the way. Let me do a quick check-in on those that might have joined, and there might be some questions that we want to respond to. Let me have a quick look at that. Put the glasses on. Swipe left. Okay, Zach. Yeah, no, we're good there. Nobody. And Math, how you going? Good to see you, son. Righto, we're coming back on to things. Let's flip the camera around and let's start looking at this little set. So you can see at the front of this, two figures that I did a little while ago. Let me just pull them down here. And they're probably in their natural positions. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the structure of the display. So these little guys, there's a third one to come. This little guy's coming in, enter stage right. This little guy's in front of the said structure with a stack of ammo boxes. He's actually issuing out ammunition. He's looking at the arrival. This little guy's from the Wellingtons. This little guy's a native. The unit was called the Native Contingent, but they Maori soldiers who were employed in primarily trench digging and supporting the infantry units. And this is their first arrival at what was called number 1 pa, which was the site. Pa is the Maori word for a village. Okay, so what we've got these guys is actually the little Wellington guy is here, little soldier coming in is here, and then just in the front is the officer, which we haven't got here. He's tucked away safely in the cabinet. In fact, he's not. He's at the beach with his legs chopped off because we're doing a bit of a conversion on him at the moment. Right, so 3 figures, that's a vignette. Let's just come in and let's have a look at the base here, and I want to talk a little bit more about that base. Okay, starting from the ground up, this outstanding. I talked about this before, the importance of size, shape and structure. This may not be the eventual base, and you'll see the reason for that in a second, but you can see the quality of that finish. That comes from Steve Kirtley, SK Miniatures. And what's really neat is I'm a big fan of Steve's Burl bases. This one was custom made, so I sent through the sizes and he was able to get one for that size that he had. Just amazing. And it fits perfectly for Andy's little display here. So, fantastic base, a bit of an investment. That really weighs it's got some real weight in that. This is loosely put on the top there, see that? So for those that follow Andy Belsey and have a look at his trench scenes, you would have seen a lot of the work that he's actually done in the past. For those that haven't seen it, I'd certainly ask you or suggest that you go on and have a look for Andy Belsey, B-E-L-S-E-Y, and just search Andy Belsey trench models in Google and you'll get his photos coming through. Been viewed many thousands of times. But what Andy's got here in terms of the base, we've got this little board that he's used, and then he's got some material that he's just laid on the top and scratched a little bit of an effect in, which we painted up. But what I'll actually use, I've got tucked away here, I've actually got some of the material from the actual from Gallipoli, where I visited with my son. That's from Baby 700, which was one of the features at the Anzacs fought over with the Turks when they were trying to invade Turkey. All these little elements are loose on here, so I've just got to be careful because Andy sent this through as a little flat pack. He's got the top there in sandbags, bottom in sandbags, all handmade in terms of epoxy putty. And then what he's got these lovely little balsa wood elements that he's constructed. And he's got pie tin, he's got all these blankets. Now this was actually based on a fantastic scene in one of Peter Jackson's displays, the Great War Exhibition that we had in Wellington during the centennial of the First World War. Ran for 4 years. Sadly, it's gone now. You can see that little guy sort of little loop. It just pops off there. There's a little corrugated iron on the top. And he's numbered those little fellas in terms of that structure. So key design elements that I really like about this, you notice that he's got that bit of an angle where you've got the enter from stage right. You've got a narrowing over to the left hand side. Nothing straight, nothing perfectly square to the base. Everything intended to lead the eye from the story. And in this case, it will be reading from left to right. You've got the officer issuing direction, and he's very much based upon that uncle scene. Now, Andy's blanked off the side of this because, of course, it carries on through. I've got some blankets temporarily there, which I may or may not use. Now, this is just the start. Inside that little hut, we'll have a pile of equipment, and we'll have it stacked along the front. And I've just popped one of these little ladders from Darren that I got last night in the front, just to sort of give you a scope for it. So I've actually got these guys, 1, 2, coming through. And in fact, if I just pop, just thinking about this, just pop Uncle, who is actually the same master figure. The difference is my little Maori officer, he's pointing or indicating with the palm of his hand in the direction that he wants the young officer to go. And the veteran, who's been there for a couple of months, is sort of casting his eye on and has been busy getting the supplies ready for the newly arrived troops. Okay, so a little bit of a story there. I've given you some structure, so key structural elements. You never have anything square. You consider a good solid base that you start on, and then you build up from there. And you can do this design work as part of getting ready for that basing. We originally started with a concept, a little bit of a sketch. I popped it through to Andy. He composed these elements, sent them down to me. I've been working on the figures over the last few years. All of them you can see on corks with pinning, talked about that. So a lot of that basing element can all be done prior to coming through for assembly. So what we're now going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to talk about assembly. Let me just pop away here. Okay, so we've been talking about basing, we're talking about handling with care, we're talking about function, the function of the base for holding the figure, for displaying it, and for using it for photography purposes, which we'll talk a little bit more about. We've talked about the design, and now we're going to talk about the story. And the last bit, I'm going to just go through 3 or 4 figures, and I'm going to talk to you about the components of basing in terms of how you use it to tell a story, how you use it to build on the figure itself. So it's not just a simple display, it's got a little bit more to it. We'll have a look at that in a second. All right, let me move Andy's one out of the way. I'll just pop you to one side there for now. I want to, as I said, handle with care. Pop the little fellas out of the way. While I'm doing this, any questions? Think of that through? Anyone typing questions away there? Or is it just me talking to the masses? No, it doesn't look like anybody coming through on that one. Okay. Righto. Let me just come back again. I'm going to pop back up onto the shelf here, folks. And just pull it around a little bit. Okay. Just going to move that out of the way. And while we're doing this, what I'm going to actually do, let's have a quick check, make sure there's no questions, no added parts coming on there. Okay, Jay Martin, good to see you, my man. And nice to see Rob. Lots of sun, yeah, plenty of sun here at this end, man. You up for a paint swap sometime? Yeah, could do, man, could do. Let's have a think about that, eh? You get in contact with me offline and we'll see what we can do, eh? Jay, fabulous work putting together Figure Illustrated magazine, Historical Figure Illustrated magazine. Did a couple of articles which talked more deeply about what I actually did in terms of my journey to where I'm at. Now, team, leave that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, we'll do a bit of a summary in a minute. I want to just talk about the final part of telling a story. I've got 3 or 4 figures here that I want to use as part of that display and just talk it through, right? Let me just come down. I've got a clear bench here and I'm going to flip around. Now, I did miss out on one component. When I talked about the display, just a simple display piece, this one here probably sums up all the elements. Probably a third one with this little fellow coming through here. Little New Zealand Long Range Desert Group Trooper, big passion of mine. New Zealand Soldiers, the Anzacs. What you can see on there is, in terms of this consideration for design, size and shape, what I wanted to talk about was just, you see the bust, you see the base is about the same size. Again, a Steve Kirtley, beautiful burl base, where the base is just as important as the figure in terms of this for pure display. That's the simplest form that you can get for display. Okay, what I've done there is enhance it slightly. Nameplate, some nice little outfits that can put those together. You can either make those yourself, or I got this done by a local engraver. And in my case, I've got a little replica LRDG, Long Range Desert Group badge, which has actually helped. The other thing that I've used in the past, and this is a nice thing that you see, you know, the master of this with dioramas is Per Olav Lund, who always puts elements into his scenes. This is again a little vial with earth from, this is actually from Baby 700, which is on Aribunu, the Gallipoli Peninsula. I collected that when I was with my son. So the display of that, using it is a critical part of it. So that's the simplest part of telling a story. I've got the bust, I've got the little badge. It just adds a little tiny bit to that, right? Take that another step further and you get this little fellow coming in. Okay, some of you might have seen this guy online. Let me pull him through. I might just change this up a little bit. Move the trench out of the way. And yes, for those that have noticed, that's old artillery plotting boards I've got tucked in the back there. So this little First Guard's an absolute favourite of mine, by sculpted originally by Andrei Bleskin out of Russia. Andrei's the sculptor behind all of the Copper State models figures that some of you might have seen. Now, this is the most simple story elements we've had. Both the little LRDG guy tucked away there with the badging. That's one element. The second part of it, you can see this little white rose badge tucked in here with the nameplate. The other part, of course, is that little element of adding some scenery in there, some groundwork. I tend to use something I got from Shep Payne, really neat, just a little paper mache fill for something thin like this, and that's just been put in. And in terms of this, that simple story I wanted to talk about, this is just prior to the Battle of Towton. And yes, they should be joined together, but it's town in the UK, very famous battle in the War of the Roses. The night before that, it was quite a cold night. This little guy's got a little goose on his back there. Love that element of him, tucked away. And he's a little halberdier heading off to the battle. You can see how old that one is, 2005. I actually completed that back in my Med-Rom days. And the little element that helps tell that story, and I can explain that story as part of the display, is a little bit of snow, a little bit of, it's actually frost on there, and I used ground glass there. So if you haven't got some ground glass, do get some hold of that. There's a whole heap of different products that you can use now for frost and snow. That's my favourite. I got it from a deer modelling friend who's no longer with us, sadly, but he gave me the stash of this ground glass, and that's just intended to give that sense of the coolness as he's heading off to that Battle of Towton back in the day. So that's the simplest form of basing. Good solid base. You can see in this case the base is about the same size as the figure, right? So 54mm figure, 54mm, approximately the same, 54, 60mm in terms of height. So that's what I would describe as the very simplest form. Needs a little bit of interpretation. But what I also want to do is, that's really just a display element coming through. I'm going to pop them to one side. I'm going to bring this next one, and remember I talked about today, we're looking at the display of figures. Again, this is a special one. Really neat to have my sons calling out to me on the video today. Matt and Ed. And this is, for me, this is a Father's Day gift as part of that process, and it's the story of William Tell and Walter. Now, specifically what I'm talking about in this little guy, you can see a pair, just an absolutely inspiring sculpt from Andrea Giulia, produced by Pegaso for a special Swiss World Expo show, commemorative figure. Now what I did with this one is, if you look carefully on the front there, and I'm just getting a suitable pointer, this is the next stage. So if you've got a simple story with the elements in terms of the halberdier coming through, you've got the ice and the area. This guy goes a little bit deeper, and it's what I call, in terms of the story, it's a hinting at the story. So at the front here I've got a little apple. For those that know the story of William Tell, he saved his son from the ruler, who was actually the local regional commander. And what he had to do is he had to shoot that apple off his son's head to show that he was such a good crossbowman. Just an amazing story. So a little apple split in half by the crossbow bolt. So he just recovered him. Little tree, that's a proper little soft branch out of the garden. And then on the back of this, you can just see, just tucked away there, I want to be very careful with that, just in here is a rotten apple. So this allegory of the rotten apple, the good apple, and the father and son embracing. So that's what I'd suggest in terms of basing and scenic elements. That's what I'd be talking about, figure display, where you're hinting at a deeper story. There's more to it. The simple elements, the simple physical display, and here we're talking about hinting at the story. Okay, trust that's useful. Let's pop that out of the way. And I'm going to come to the last part of it. So we're talking about how you can use the display to tell a deeper story. So this is a very special figure that I'm bringing in, very special for me. Okay, I'll need to get these other chaps out of the way. And no, he doesn't have a nameplate as yet, but he will have. Now this figure's not commercial. It's a one-off, and it's based on a very famous painting, a very famous photograph of a West Australian officer named Phil Henry Fry. And Phil Fry was famous at Gallipoli, and the photo shows him just leaning away from the wall of a trench. He's got another chap and a little trench dug out to the side. And this commemorates Phil. It's not the figure's not finished. It's certainly one that I'll be finishing this year. It's in very much its formative stages. It's in the formative painting stages from the artist that created it, master sculptor, and again another inspiration, mate of mine, Phil Walden, expat Kiwi living in Australia. It's got all the elements, and Phil's renowned for his ability to bring real character to figures. So the figure's very important. As I said, Phil started in his standard painting style. I'll paint that whole figure, and I'll finish off the groundwork elements. I've got elements to add in terms of this. He's got a little set of binos that he's got. He's got set of binos and some a little lanyard for a whistle that I'll add to it, but I'll get that finished off. Now, the reason for sharing this one is because what I wanted to do is, again, it hints at the terrain as part of it. It hints at the photo and when displayed. And what I will do is look at putting the actual photo on the side here to display. But what Phil's done, and this is one of the elements that Phil does, he really integrates the base into the scene itself. And you can see it actually building down into it. So it's not only hinting at it, but it's actually starting to tell the story. And it's the base is something that you can secure, you can handle with care, but it's also a critical part of this figure telling a story. Based off his famous photo, that famous photo likely to go on the side with a little nameplate on the side, and potentially I'd display it on that 3/4 view, so quite different from what you normally do. Instead of the flat side, you get the real effect here with Phil Fry looking up from you. Phil Fry was killed in a battle on Hill 60, which was a famous campaign. He'd been involved in Lone Pine and the like, and having visited that location, and the memory behind that was really special. Now you do notice that, and this is what I want to suggest in this part I'm talking about. We talked about first the simple visual display elements. We talked about hinting at it, and this is where the base has become an integral part of the story of the figure. And no more so than, as you can see, these flat sides as you turn it round, and this is part that I will actually keep of Phil's original work. Phil's actually autographed it, you can see there, just amazing. And what he's actually done, he's actually painted the groundscape from Gallipoli on the back there. Now that's an artwork in itself, an impressionist style of the Gallipoli Heights. And trust me, this is just around Baby 700, correction, around Hill 60. And looking from Hill 60, which isn't a very noticeable feature when you're actually standing on it, but around it has the heights of Gallipoli, and that's exactly the way it is. Okay, again, a very special piece for me. I'll retain those elements, and as I come round will be the real collaboration from Phil, that beautifully natural posed image of Captain Phil Fry as he just saying hi to the cameraman. Can't recall who took the photo. I'm not too sure if we actually know who took the photo, but as he just gets up from the trench. So that's today in terms of, so let's just do a quick recap of where we came. We'll do a quick scoot around the bench, around the various components that we talked about. Let's just pull out. So we talked about the very first part of it was around the simple function of basing. We talked about being able to hold the figure. Okay, we talked about the pin under his foot, which is integral from moving from this simple function of the figure itself being painted, and we use that same pin to connect them to the base. We then went on to talk about basing that was used for final display, and we talked about different types, and we talked about props, and we're going to come back to these couple tomorrow as part of our photography session. We talked about using components as part of that display, and I shared some of the basing elements like the dirt from Baby 700, like the little elements that you can get from Tommy's War and Darren and the team there. Darren is the team. Okay, we talked about that section, the top, the function, and then we started talking about design, and we talked about size, shape, and structure. And the little example that I gave you there, let's pull that away. Always be on the watch out for different elements. You've got the commercial bases that were made for the piece. And then you've got those little treasures that you find. The curtain finial, the little keepsake box with a little arrowhead. So glad I found that. That can become bases. You're talking about size, shape, and then we finished with that little discussion around structure and the example of how you start with a solid base, you build up the elements, compose it like a kit, and then practice putting those guys together with it, so you've actually got the sense of what it actually is. The elements that make up not just the figure, but the base that supports it. And the last part is we took that from telling a story. So that very first part of the story, we talked about 3 components. We talked about the simple visual elements. We talked about the hint of the story, the good apple and the rotten apple, and the story of fatherhood. And then we finish with the last one, where the base becomes the integral to telling the story about the figure and the character that appears. And again, a call out to inspirational Anzac modeller Phil Walden, who's created his namesake Phil Fry from the 10th Light Horse, West Australia's. And that, guys, is about it. Before I go, let me just do a quick wrap. We're going to go back up. We'll see where we're at. And I'll have a quick look at the notes as we scan through. Hope you've enjoyed this Facebook Live session. For those that didn't make it, I do hope you get a chance to get into tomorrow's one. Okay. And Marcus, good to see you, man. Have a look at the replay, see what you got. Tony, glad you liked it. Hey, this is the second to last one. Tomorrow's the last one. It's going to be on photography. Some of you might have seen in the background. There's the camera. Okay, set up. And just beside it is the photo booth. We'll be getting that set. We'll be using the props here. Look, again, photography is something I'm learning, and had a number of years learning through that process. Getting stronger has become an important part of the story that I tell with my display. It's been an important part of capturing the way I approach figure modeling. And I'm hoping that, well, no, look, seriously, just sharing that story tomorrow will hopefully help you in terms of what you're doing on that. I want to say thanks very much for spending the time with me. For those who want to know a little bit more about what I'm doing, where I'm going, and where this is all heading, feel free to connect with me on Patreon. I'm going to be spending a lot more time there, and I'm going to be sharing some more videos, more in depth about what I've been doing on Patreon. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. For now, stay safe, be kind, and look after your family and friends. Great talking to you. Really appreciate it. I'll follow up with any comments after this. Bye all.